Good afternoon, and welcome to D&I One-on-One, a monthly webinar series where we talk about different topics related to culture, inclusivity, diversity, and belongingness. And today our conversation, moving beyond buzzwords. In other words, what are we talking about in D&I in the national conversation? I'm Jina Etienne, and after a 26 plus year career as a practicing CPA in public accounting, I'm now a consultant, trainer, and speaker. My work is centered on something that I call fearless inclusion, which I define as the freedom to be yourself and the ability to create space for others to do the same. I develop trainings and workshops focused on the core skills necessary for driving organizational change, but starting within each of us. My programs revolve around four key elements: leading inclusively, navigating diversity, crafting culture, and conscious communication. My passion is helping professionals build deep connections, cultivate safety, and thrive as inclusive, mindful, and trusted leaders. Joining me today is Bernadette Smith, founder and CEO of the Equality Institute and an award-winning author of 4 books, including her latest, the bestseller, Inclusive 360, Proven Solutions for an Equitable Organization. Her insight has been trusted by major brands, including Fortune 500 companies and global leadership teams. Because of Bernadette's impact as a change agent for inclusion, she has been featured in the New York Times, Forbes, CNN, and The Today Show. She's also been named one of Chicago's notable LGBTQ executives by Crain's Chicago Business. When she's not busy speaking, you're likely to find her on a local pickleball court, which is exactly where you'll not find me. Bernadette, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you, Jina. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for inviting me, and give me a little thumbs up in the chat if any of you out there play pickleball, because I've already played once today, and my obsession continues. It's really a pleasure. Thank you.
Maybe one day I'll get out there. I see it, but I don't play it. Actually, nobody wants me playing sports in general. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, it's what we're seeing in the headlines about the pullback from DEI. And so there you go. What's the deal? Bernadette, is DEI really going away?
No, it's not going away. Don't believe the headlines. Don't believe the clickbait. DEI is alive and well. I saw some data earlier this week that I think it's like 87% of Fortune 500 companies haven't really changed their DEI programs at all. It's really there have been some very public retractions. There have been some companies who have decided not to complete the Human Rights Campaign Corporate Equality Index anymore, for example, and that's a barometer of LGBTQ plus inclusion. But what they're saying they're doing instead is integrating DEI into all of their business functions. And honestly, I think that's really the best way forward anyway, as we'll talk about today, because DEI is a lens that should really be applied to all function and not just sort of be like this extra thing. If it's an extra thing, then people have competing priorities. It's not going to feel organic, right? And so when it's integrated, it's going to be much more sustainable, much more successful, replicable, scalable, all of that stuff. So that's really my goal, and I think it's not going anywhere. And honestly, let's be completely honest. The changing demographics here in the U.S. would not even allow it to be, to be pulled away, because here I think we know that the census has told us that almost 50% of Gen Z are people of color. About 15% of Americans have some sort of form of disability. Over 20% of Gen Z are somehow LGBTQ plus, part of that community. So, the diversity demographics are here. And so organizations can afford to pull back from it.
Yeah, I do think that too often we see these terms in the headlines. We hear a lot about DEI as if it in and of itself is a thing, rather than the nuances and complexities within the work. And to your very point about the demographics, if we did nothing, we would still be doing something. If we didn't call it DEIB or any combination of the letters in that acronym, we would intuitively be doing the work because we're starting to see a lot more diversity showing up at work. And just like when women started joining the workforce, changes needed to be made. The same is happening now. It's just those changes are rapid.
They are rapid, and certainly they were rapid in sort of the acceleration of DEI, and it was extremely rapid in 2000, I guess, in 2000 in 2020, when it's the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. And so the racial justice uprisings and the pandemic all accelerated DEI, and so it was happening very fast. And if you could move to the next slide, it'll show you some of the headlines we saw in 2020, hiring more Black people, pledging to remedy the racial wealth gap, increasing diversity in other employees. Like these are big companies committing billions of dollars to DEI, making huge pledges. And honestly, this was what was needed. There was a little bit of catch up that needed to happen, a little bit of an overcorrection, honestly, because there had been so much sort of stagnation and a lack of attention paid to racial equity. So we had to sort of go to that extreme to sort of come back and figure out, okay, well, what is the sweet spot right here where it feels like everyone's going to have a role in this? Because ultimately, I personally believe, I don't know about you, Jina, but I personally believe that DEI means everyone, because we are all diverse in whatever ways we happen to be diverse. We have elements of our identities, and maybe they're not sort of the visible elements of diversity. Maybe they are invisible disabilities. Maybe there are medical conditions. We are always having these levels of layers of diversity that we each have. And so it's really about thinking of DEI very, very broadly, and knowing that in order to truly be successful, in order to truly reap the rewards of diversity, we need to bring everyone along for the ride,
Yeah,
for this
we need to see.
conversation.
Yeah, we need to see all identities reflected in this conversation. And I think to your point about 2020 and the racial justice movement that followed, for many, if this was when they first started to see DEI in their organizations, they equated DEI to race. And I think then quickly what got attached to that is LGBTQ, everything, all things related to the community, even though that work had been being done in moving forward in really great ways over the last 10 years. So I think if you go back and look at just the evolution of this work, we started with just think of it as, rooted in the Civil Rights Act and all of the work that followed, even though I know there was a lot of work that happened. And so much of that language still lingers today. We talk about anti-discrimination and equal opportunity and accommodation. We talk about these terms, and I think people equate that to DEI. So DEI is just new language for those, but it's more than that.
It is more than that. And I think that one thing that we all need to remember is that when we're thinking about DEI and we're thinking about really sort of the promises of DEI, we need to remember that it is a long game, right? This is not something where we're going to see major changes happen overnight. It's not something where we're going to see huge companies completely shifting all of their hiring practices. I mean, it is really a long game because we're talking about change management in a lot of cases, right? And so if you could actually play the next slide, Jina, sort of give you evidence of how long of a game it is. So pay attention, folks, to the legend down there. You can see this is a screenshot from the study done by McKinsey and Lean In. And so essentially at the entry level of organizations, and this is data, from all across hundreds of organizations all across the US. At the entry level of organizations, the percentage of men versus women, people of color versus white people, it's all pretty balanced at this entry level. But let's take a look at what happens as folks start to move up the ladder. Will you press play?
Absolutely. Oops, sorry. Clearly, I don't know how to press play. All right, try it again.
And so this information, this data shows us that as folks move up the levels of organization, the percentage of men versus women we start to see more men, and we specifically start to see more white men getting promotions and moving up the levels. And so, we can see that there were lots of pledges made in 2020, but there hasn't been a lot of progress made in those few years. So it takes time. This is a long game. It requires sustained commitment. And it really requires us to realize that we need to bring everyone along for this ride. Everyone needs to have a sense of purpose in this if we're really going to achieve the promises of diversity. We see all these other headlines about, companies with diverse teams, they're like 35% more profitable, or, companies that have employees that mirror their customer demographics are more profitable. We hear all of these sort of like aspirational numbers. Let's get more money with diversity, right? We hear that, but it takes time, and it really takes everyone to get on board with this. So I really think that, diversity means everyone, inclusion means everyone, inclusion transcends identity. And so when we think about things more broadly, we can bring more people on this journey, and we can actually start to reap those rewards of diversity.
I have so many notes, things that I want to bring up. Let's go back to, one. You were talking about the rapid change in demographics. And even though the work is slow, this is the long game. We also know that if you look at, you mentioned the census. If you go back to the census before that, in the 10 years between those two, the change was actually kind of fast. And even one of the things I think I hear people talking about a lot are the different generations in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
Today, the largest generation is Gen Z, but that wasn't the case 5 years ago. Or maybe it was because I didn't do that specific data point research. How does that sync up with this is really a long game? It's going to take a while.
Well, they might be in the workforce, but they're still at the lower level, right? And so we need to set everyone up for success. I think that means that we need to look at building internal leadership development pipelines, internal leadership development capacities, focus on creating opportunities where everyone is set up for success and where everyone gets a fair and equitable chance to achieve. I think if you take a look at those pie graphs that I showed you, you'll see that, that's just not fair. If we start at the entry level and it's all pretty balanced, and as it moves up, it's not, well, there's something wrong there. And so we need to fix that. And by fixing it, we need to just think about how can we set everyone up for success, give everyone a fair shot to succeed, put lots of diverse kinds of people in the rooms where it happens, right? Because right now, that's just not always the case. But if we really want to achieve the rewards of diversity, we need to really start mirroring the client base, the customer base.
I just want everybody to know, if you haven't done so already, please download the handout. Because on the handout, what I did, Bernadette, is I actually did some little screenshots from each of these moments that it changed. And so on the handout, since they won't be able to play the video, everyone, you have each of the individual pie charts. So it might even be interesting for you to just sort of scan your eye over that to see the point that you're making, Bernadette. Because at the end, when you look at the percentage of men and people of color and women and people of color, that goes to show your point that when you're in the C-suite, generally speaking, they're going to be boomers or older Gen Xers. I think it's Gen X that follows. But that also goes along with the demographics of the populations at the time, which means as we go forward in the years to come, we're going to rapidly see that diversity, but will we see that at the leadership levels? And so I don't know, you haven't done this research, and I don't know that you've done any projections in terms of your research, but that sounds about right.
Yeah, I think that it's going to be inevitable, but we have to sort of get the systems in place for folks to really get that fair shot. But let's actually, and I think part of how we get there is through, I have a model called PSA. So if you get to the PSA slide, this is really where I think we need to move is organizations need to have a strong sense of purpose around DEI. There needs, and individual managers, individuals on teams need to understand what their personal purpose around DEI is. So purpose has got to be this sort of people first message that employees, that they can rally around. And I think it's important also for leaders to share their own individual sense of purpose for this work so that they can be able to share, to connect with their more diverse employees, and that they can get more buy-in. So purpose is really key. And so I want to sort of share a couple of questions, does the organization, like sort of reflection questions. So does your organization have a DEI mission? Does it have a vision or a strategy statement? And if it does, has that actually been communicated to the employees? So if you can actually go forward, you can see some statements of purpose. So Salesforce believes that the business of business is to improve the state of the world, serving the interests of all our stakeholders. So that's a very people-centered statement of purpose. I mean, Target's purpose is to help all families discover the joy of everyday life. So it's, again, people-focused. MasterCard's purpose is to connect and power an inclusive digital economy that benefits everyone, everywhere, by making transactions safe, simple, smart, and accessible. So I love these statements of purpose because they are people first. Employees can get excited about it. But I would also encourage individual managers to think about what is their purpose for this work. Is it because you have a child who's part of the LGBTQ plus community, or maybe you have an in-law or an in-law who's biracial, or a biracial grandchild, or maybe you have someone in your family with disabilities or who's on the spectrum of some sort. What is your purpose for this? How can you connect to this work? I want you to do it for them, right? Because we see these headlines about the retraction, about the pullback. In order to keep going, we need to know our purpose. We need to know our why. Simon Sinek says, start with why. What is your why for this work? Make it personal to you. Managers figure out what that personal purpose is and talk about it. Organizations have a people-centered statement of purpose and get people excited about it. So that's the P, that's the purpose in PSA. Then I'll get into the rest in a minute. You can go back to the other slide.
Well, before you do that, and let's stick with purpose for a second, because the language that we started to see when the work started popping up everywhere in 2020 was business case. And the idea was that the business case is the purpose. And so how do you differentiate for those who are focused on business case as proving the purpose? What's the difference?
Well, they're not mutually exclusive, right? So, I think that in order to even get the investment to create a state of purpose or to have any DEI initiatives, we need to understand the business case. And the business case is all of that data, the 35% more profitability. That's the type of stuff. That's the business case. But that's not going to be enough, in order for people to really buy in order for people to really connect to this work, there's got to be two things. There's got to be data. So there's the business case part, but there's also got to be storytelling. And storytelling is the humanity. It's the empathy. It's about perspective taking, right? And so that's where the personal purpose comes in. It's about having both data and stories to get maximum buy-in from all different kinds of employees because people are motivated by different things. So they go hand in hand.
I realize my next question is strategy, so I'll hold that one. Do you want to
Okay,
jump
so
in and
yeah.
talk about that? Yeah.
Yeah, so strategy, let's go forward a few slides. Their slide about training. Strategy, I
Next
think
one.
nope, back one.
Back
So I think
one.
nope, was there one about
Oh wait,
nope,
I think there are in this one.
this one. Yes, this one. Yeah, and so a lot of times organizations are like, okay, it's time to do DEI. Let's just do an unconscious bias training, right? And so that's sort of the strategy. That's sort of like, okay, let's check the box. Let's do this unconscious bias training. Yet we know that unconscious bias training might not always help because people don't always like to be told that they have bias. Even if they're told that everyone has bias, it makes people feel defensive. Like, no, I'm not
Yeah.
biased, right? And so
Bernadette, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's because isn't bias now a dirty word when it comes to,
yeah,
in the workplace? It's like there's something wrong with us. Nobody wants to
exactly
be
right.
wrong. Yeah.
Exactly. And so we see these headlines and I get it because people feel defensive. They feel like, oh my goodness, that's not me. I have a friend who's gay, like I'm not biased, they feel, and then they sort of go into defensive mode, and that's not going to help anyone learn. That's not going to help us fulfill the promises of diversity. All of those, profitability stuff, the business case stuff, we don't get there by just planning an unconscious bias training. That's not how we get there. In order to truly reap the rewards of diversity, we need a holistic approach. So if you can go to the slide, the other pie slide with the different functions. Yeah. We need to have an approach that is bringing DEI into all of the functions of an organization. And that is how you get to a point of Inclusive 360, which is the name of my book. And so we need to think about how are we bringing a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion into recruiting, into comp and benefits, into talent development and learning and development, into communications, internal and external, into events, into procurement, into the sales customer experience. How does that, we have to bring it into that as well, into the manufacturing and product design and product development. It should be brought into all of these functions and not just sort of feel like an extra thing, right? The goal here is to embed equity and inclusion into the normal way business is done so it becomes the default.
Right.
That is the goal, to make it the default as opposed to it feeling extra. No one wants extra work. So let's set up the systems or let's adjust the systems where this DEI lens is just part of the steps. It's part of how things are done, because that's how we can start to create an environment where DEI is replicable, scalable, sustainable, and ultimately normal.
Normal.
And if
Right.
that normal.
It goes without saying we're doing this, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So it's not one person's job. It's just the way it's done.
Right.
And
Right.
so we don't have to keep having these conversations. If it just is sort of the way things are done. We're bringing this perspective in. And so, yeah, it's not going to, it's certainly not going to happen overnight. But when we're talking about strategy, when we're talking about the S, we need to think broadly. And so going back to your earlier question about, the retraction of DEI and these companies sort of saying, hey, we're pulling back from all this. Well, if you read the fine print, many of them are saying we're pulling back from this, or we don't have a chief diversity officer anymore because we're adding it to our normal business operations. And so if that is true, and I'd like to believe that they're not lying to us, if that is true, then okay, cool, because that's my vision anyway. That's where we need to go.
Right. In your research for the book, Did you notice or did you pull out and evaluate those organizations or the effect of the pullback versus those organizations that have been successfully implementing D&I, even something that is close to your PSA model? Have you noticed whether there's been movement one way or the other, more measurable success one way or the other?
It's all too soon to tell, because especially because there are so many other market factors right now.
Mhm.
Post pandemic, there's so many other things going on for there to be, really clear, and from my perspective, really clear correlations made. And plus, there are people who are data heads who are much better at that stuff than I am.
Data heads. Listen, we're talking to a bunch of although not everyone that's attending today is an accountant, and even if we're accountants, we're not all data heads. But just I thought I'd throw that out there because some of us like to do that analysis. One of the questions that I had in my parking lot that I said related to strategy was, especially as I look at this graphic that you put together, is this top down or is this bottom up? How do we get it infused or woven in or embedded? Is it one team? Is it leadership's responsibility to develop this, since it's not a strategy, develop or identify how it is embedded in each of these areas?
Yeah, it's absolutely leadership, because they're going to have that's who people are going to listen to, right? And so what we saw, as there were so many chief diversity officers and directors of DEI and all of this hired over the past few years, so many of them are reporting to HR. And if you look at this model, that's not how it should go, right? Because if we're bringing DEI to all of the functions, then it doesn't belong in HR. And so any sort of chief diversity officer, I think, should have a direct report to the C-suite and someone in the C-suite. And that's really where it should live, not in HR. And ultimately, yes, if we want to make sure that we are sort of fulfilling these promises of DEI, then we need to have it come from leadership, because if it's, there's going to be some pressure from employees. But ultimately, the statement of purpose and the real, work to integrate this and make DEI the default, it has to come from the C-suite.
One of the things that I think is interesting when it comes to D&I, at least I've experienced this with some of my clients, and that is when you talk to leadership and leadership says, we get it, we stand behind it, we still don't see a lot of, I guess the word I'll think of is literacy, that we talk about DEI or we see leadership talk about DEI in ways that almost sound like the statement that people put on their website, but then we don't necessarily see it spoken about or referred to on a day-to-day basis or in the language that is used as they navigate and lead and manage. Is that something that you saw when you were talking with different companies doing your research?
Yeah, I think that it certainly is, in a lot of cases, theoretical, right? But we also know that so much of the influence has to live with managers,
Yes.
right? And so for it to really trickle down, we can't sort of keep it up in the leadership. The managers need to understand how to talk about this, which is why having a personal sense of purpose and sort of having your own kind of talking points about this is going to be really key for managers in order to get buy-in.
So if unconscious bias training doesn't work, is there a type of training that does? Because I know that for some that are listening today, they might not be able to walk back to their organizations and then just influence sort of this holistic approach. Maybe they can come back and just take one recommendation. And so actually, I have some questions in a lot of areas, and we don't have that much time. But is there a type of training that does work? Because so many people, I know for me, their employee resource groups or their committees that plan their internal events, they might have an opportunity to influence this by bringing in certain types of training or programs.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I personally don't think that unconscious bias training should be off the table, because I think that there's a lot of value in raising awareness about the neuroscience behind the lack of diversity, right? There's a
Absolutely.
lot of science behind it that sort of goes back to hunters and gatherers and fight and flight. And I don't need to get into any of that now, but the science behind it is real. And I think when we understand the science, it sort of gives us a little bit of more understanding of why we tend to surround ourselves with people who are like us, why we tend to have a lack of diversity within our personal and professional networks for the most part, right? And so I think that there is definitely value there. And I also think that it's important to not just focus on what we're doing wrong, but stay really positive and focus on what can be done better and what can be done right. So that sort of goes with my model, the inclusive 360 model, is thinking about DEI as really a series of small tactics. And my book is just packed with actionable strategies within every function. So within thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, but also thinking about each individual function, well, what are some of the best in class organizations doing on a very practical level? And there are a few slides that we can get to about that as well. But I also, before I forget, I want to just make sure, actually, if you could show the few slides, including the Spanish language one. Yeah, this is just a really simple example of how an organization, a company, can attract more diverse employees. We're job postings in multiple languages, signage within organizations in multiple languages. So simple. The first one is about attracting more diversity. The second one is about including folks who are more diverse, in this case, Spanish language speakers, right? And so these are some simple tactical things that even any organization can look to adopt as they start to do this work.
I think it's interesting the one on the left has a QR code, because I think the other thing that organizations could think about is just the simplicity of universal design and thinking about what changes they can make that serve everybody. And that serve people with different needs. And the QR code just got me thinking about leveraging technology. So imagine that I could have the same information in 6 other languages. And rather than putting 7 or 8 languages on the poster or the sign, that QR code allows people to be able to access the same information in another language. I'm not saying that's what's here. It's just an idea that popped into my head.
Yeah. I think that's great. I think that the more we can do to create opportunities that enhance diversity, that enhance inclusion, that set people up for success, the more it's going to benefit everyone. I think there's another slide. Yeah, this is the slide about supplier diversity. So Target has done a really beautiful job specifically around supplier diversity. They do things like they have a special set of products during that they really amplify, particularly during Black History Month. They've leveraged their Black business resource group to identify Black-owned businesses that they can elevate and amplify, through their supplier diversity program, get these products on shelves. Give them a special section you can filter on the Target website. This gives a really strong sense of purpose to the Black Business Resource Group. It gives a strong sense of purpose to supplier diversity team. They also have mentorship and pro bono business development programs for businesses that come with diverse owners, however they might be diverse. And so Target is taking a really holistic approach to this. They're looking they're bringing DEI to all of the lenses within all of the functions within their organization. So, this is another example. It's a higher level example. It's a big company, but they're doing it right.
I do think I've also seen this in boutique stores. I live in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. So there is no lack of diversity in the products that you can get. But I also found that in even small boutiques, you will find products from a particular part of the world, or that feature or focused around a different particular style or aesthetic. And so I do see that even small businesses have an opportunity to do things like this. You don't have to be as big as Target, in other words, to be able to highlight either the services that you offer, the products that you offer, the clients that you serve. In the case of, a CPA firm, for example, they might specialize in a particular industry or in a particular service line, but they can also start to look at what is it that their clients do in terms of differences around identity. So just a different way for people to start maybe reflecting back on your organization to see what you're doing that lines up with what we're seeing here.
Absolutely. And I think sort of back to the question earlier about top down, bottom up, and, it's an alternative to unconscious bias training. As CPAs, you're client facing probably, or you might have some people on your team who are. Well, what's the level of cultural competency you have with diverse clients? I mean, a cultural competency training is a very practical way to be more inclusive. It doesn't have to do with unconscious bias. It's just practical skills building to help you understand your more increasingly diverse client base. And so, there's lots of ways to sort of bring this to whatever industry and whatever size business.
It's an interesting point that you make, because I know there are a lot of firms that are going through acquisitions right now. There's a lot of acquisition. And then there are also a lot of firms, even small firms, that are starting to partner with other firms overseas. And so how do you communicate when you've just merged with a firm in the UK, or you are now contracting with a firm in India or a firm in the Philippines? And we are seeing this a lot. And so when you were talking about cultural communications, you're talking about, that's just one example you gave, that's communicating with people who have different backgrounds, experiences, language. I mean, even jargon might mean different things in different countries. So I don't know if you want to touch on that a little more. That was just one of the examples that came to mind. The other thing that I thought about when you said the neuroscience of bias, there's a whole thing about the neuroscience of how we communicate. It's kind of fascinating. Like, I want to be a neuroscientist in my next life because it's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to make sure we give plenty of time for questions. And I want to go back to the accountability piece real quick, just to sort of close the loop here. So we have purpose, people-centric purpose, managers should know their purpose. Everyone should sort of be able to speak to, what is my purpose around this? Strategy is holistic. It's not just about training. And accountability is where it all comes together. So accountability is about sharing the metrics, sharing the data, even when it's ugly. It's about being transparent. In some cases, it's about organizations meeting specific metrics and goals that they've set. And we're not talking about hiring metrics or diversity metrics specifically. We might be talking about supplier diversity spend. We might be talking about the percentage of employees who are attending, an inclusion training. But there should be some form of accountability. And sometimes that does mean that leaders are held accountable for their progress on DEI goals. But accountability is really key. Otherwise, again, none of this is going to be sustainable. So I really want to make sure I hit that as well, because, it's all going to fall flat if there's not accountability.
Right. I know we've started to see more transparency reports that different accounting firms are putting out. I think something you said there is also key. Maybe this doesn't mean putting out a public-facing report, but when you talk about transparency, maybe the numbers aren't great. I think it's okay for firms to think putting out the transparency that we don't really have the numbers because we've never really started to look at them. So, but that's a starting point, and that helps establish accountability. I know for a couple of my clients working on strategy, it was hard to find benchmarks, because you can find great benchmarks that people suggest you use, but I'm a firm of 75 people. It doesn't really apply to me. So how could then you have a recommendation that a small organization can make to maybe start to figure out what this might look like from an accountability perspective?
It can be simple. It can be about the percentage of employees who are participating in a day of service on MLK Day, or the percentage of employees who are attending an optional lunch and learn, which I'd be happy to deliver, and I'm sure you would be as well, Jina.
Yes, coincidentally.
Inclusion of your increasingly diverse clients, or whatever it happens to be, how to create a culture of belonging at work, whatever the topic happens to be. What is the percentage of people who are attending something that is optional. There's lots of different ways you can think about accountability, even within smaller firms. But this is the PSA cheat sheet. So I know I talked about the purpose, strategy, and accountability pretty quickly. If you download this cheat sheet, you'll get sort of specific conversation starters or specific, reflection points to think about. How am I doing on these things? What are some areas that I could be working a little bit harder or being a little bit more intentional? Because listen, none of this happens by accident. There has to be intention behind it.
You said this is a long game. Another way that I like to think about it is these are drops in the ocean, because it is something that, D&I is never going to be done. We can't say if we do these 363 things, we're done. It doesn't work that way. And even the little things can help drive change in a big way. So just thought I'd throw that out there. I know that we have maybe 11, 12 minutes for questions. And I've been looking at questions coming into the Q&A. Folks, I would encourage you, if you have a question, if you want to share a thought or a comment, drop it in the Q&A. And I will pretend like I know how to scroll through it in order. Did anything jump out at you as you look at the Q&A? I'm going to start scrolling through it now.
Looking at the Q&A, I haven't really paid close attention to the Q&A yet so far, I'll be honest. But looking at the priority section is where all the questions are, Jina. So
well, I will look at that. And one of the things maybe as you're looking to think about that I wanted to ask you about is, you said all voices need to be in there. And I know that there are many people who've spoken to me privately, white men in particular, who feel threatened or they feel like I can't say anything. And so when we talk about all voices, there's an example. And I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit, because I know in the accounting industry, for example, the majority of partners in firms are male and white. And so part of what some might be struggling with is simply talking about it because they don't feel like they can, or they're afraid to say the wrong thing. And then, cancel culture is a real thing. So
yeah, I think that's actually a really unfortunate place that we've gotten ourselves to as a society. I'm completely opposed to cancel culture, and I think it's really important to bring everyone along for the ride. And listen, we're going to make mistakes. I make mistakes, and I do this for a living. I accidentally offend people occasionally. It happens, right? And so I think we've got to normalize talking about making mistakes, especially because we've gotten ourselves to this place where people are so afraid of saying the wrong thing that they're walking on eggshells, right? They're saying nothing. And that just sort of keeps us siloed. It doesn't help us get together. So I have I could talk about that for a long time, because I have a specific keynote just on that topic alone, because, I just feel like we've gotten ourselves more divided instead of more cohesive. And that just breaks my heart. The diversity means everyone, and, we're all stronger together. And listen, at the end of the day, I fundamentally believe that it all comes down to sort of the universal principle across sort of all faiths of, love one another. And it really doesn't need to be rocket science, but it has to be intentional. It does not happen by accident because of unconscious bias, because of cancel culture. All of these sort of things have gotten in our way of just, cohesion.
I've decided I'm doing that on a t-shirt. It doesn't need to be rocket science. It just needs to be intentional.
Yeah.
I like that. All right. So when you all see my t-shirt up for sale, buy it. All right. Well, let's see. We have some time for questions. So now I'm scrolling through them.
I'm going to go through some of the priorities that are comments, and I'm going to mark them as answered. Okay. Thank you for these really wonderful comments and questions here, folks. I appreciate it.
There's a question here that asks, for each of us, how do we begin presenting and running these meetings? Well, I would say, rather than thinking of it that way, exploring what do you think is comfortable you're talking about in your organization, whether it's with just a group of colleagues or As you see opportunities for training coming in, maybe reaching out to those facilitating the training and asking what are the topics that are going to be included in there, and try to better understand how does that tie into diversity and inclusion. Or even facilitating a lunch and learn in your organization where you don't walk in as the subject matter expert, you walk in as another person curious about this, and you've organized it, but with you and your colleagues will explore it together. So it's not training in the traditional sense that a subject matter expert comes in and dumps information on your heads. That's horrible. I shouldn't say it that way if what I do for a living is training, but you follow what I'm saying. I think people might feel inhibited because until they're the subject matter expert, they don't want to lead something in their organization, but you really could just host a get together where people explore a conversation.
Great advice.
Let's see what else is in here. So it's interesting. There are a lot of comments. Like, for example, one gentleman said that when they were in college years ago, most of the accounting students were white males and a few white females. And so they're glad to see that there are more minorities that have gone into accounting. So absolutely, we're starting to see that trend pick up. We are seeing now, just for everybody to know, in the most recent trends report that came out from the AICPA, I want to say, if I have my years right, we have more women than men studying accounting in college today. Now, by that, I mean, it went from like 49 to 52 to 52 to like 52 to 49. Like, it's not a big change, but the fact is it's a change. It's that incremental change we're seeing. And I don't know that it's going to stay that way, but we don't have as much data on the minorities change, but the good news is that they're still in the pipeline. So there's a question here about the minimum number of employees per business that makes them accountable for affirmative action in DEI laws. I'm not sure that there is such a thing. I do know that there is a report maybe that they're referring to, the EEO1, that I think firms have to be, we have to have more than 100 employees to have to file that report. I don't remember the number if you're familiar with that, but there might
be either 50 or 100. I don't remember exactly.
There might be requirements based on if you do government contracting, you might have some requirements to fulfill for your contract. This might be true for supplier diversity. There might be state and local laws or regulations that you might need to be compliant with. Even if your firm is in multiple states, you might want to look to see if there's a requirement in one of the states that you're doing business, but not all of the others. That is a good point that they bring up in that question.
Now, I see a question here about the corporate positions identified in the beginning. If education levels or degrees are needed to hold a role, wouldn't the company do better for the DEI going to schools and finding a way to inspire the educational goals needed to move up? That's definitely one approach. I think that's a great point, Thomas. I'd also like to add that we're seeing more and more organizations. IBM is a big one. Google is another one. And even the state of Maryland, where you live, Jina, are removing degree requirements altogether because there are a whole lot of folks who have great experience, great background, but they might not have degrees for one reason or another. Degrees can be a really big barrier for folks. And so it doesn't mean that they don't have the skills or that they can't learn. And so that's another way to expand diversity, is to rethink degree requirements and focus a little bit more on skills-based hiring. But there are lots of different approaches here.
Yeah. Some of the things that came up, I want to say I started seeing it more in 2021, is questioning the job requirements themselves. And so becoming really intentional around what are the specific requirements rather than just using the same old cookie cutters. A simple example is that a common job description might have been, a requirement might have been to be able to stand for 15 minutes. And that's just, why? That might be true in some jobs, but it's not a universal requirement. And yet some companies had it in every job requirement. So thinking through that can really help organizations start to see even just more diverse candidates applying, because you've taken away a lot of the barriers simply by looking at job requirements, not just degrees.
That's right. And I see another question here about, corporations that have high employee counts in areas that are just historically not diverse. the challenge here is to think about diversity more broadly than race and ethnicity, right? Think about diversity in terms of neurodivergence and other disabilities. It could be diversity in terms of socioeconomic. I mean, there are lots of different ways to think about diversity, and lots of folks who have value to bring to the table, even if they're neurodivergent, even if they have disabilities of some sort. It does not mean that they should be excluded as a candidate. They might have a lot of value to bring. And also, remote teams absolutely expand diversity. So if you're thinking about, if you want to increase diversity, then think about how you're allowing your employees to work.
I think the point you said at the beginning was that according to the census, I think the percentage you used was about 15% of Americans have a disability. I think what most people don't realize is, depending on where you go to look for the data, 75 to 90% of those disabilities are invisible. So there's a high likelihood that there is representation in your organization that you just don't know is there. That also gets us to back to the part of collecting the data.
Exactly. Oh, I see. Great example here. Height requirements can really be discriminating without intention. Yeah, I mean, so here, thinking about height, here's another unconscious bias, because I think it's 58% of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are 6 feet or taller, but only 15% of men in the general population are 6 feet or taller. So we have a bias as humans towards taller people. And so even shorter people are less likely to get promoted. And it's an unconscious bias. So
yeah, to be fair,
it's sort
of that height bias exists in all societies. It's just the height itself varies by society. I mean, we talked earlier about bias and a dirty word, that people see it as somehow that they've done something wrong. And I think the important part of that education is to understanding it's not bias that we've done something wrong. It's understanding some of the automatic associations that we make, becoming aware of those, and then finding ways to make them more visible or to interrupt them from happening, so that we know, you mean to tell me I might have this preference because of height? Good to know. Now I can try to be more intentional and say, oh, wow, I think that's at play right now. Let me try to find a way to interrupt that. So that's a really good example of a bias most people don't think about.
Yep.
Oh, dear. Somebody says here, engagement and retention and how it's connected to employees and how it's connected to your business. I think, not exactly sure what the comment there is, but I'll make a point that when we talk about engagement, there are a lot of different markers that people can use. You used one earlier, that how many people are doing what did you say, like a social activity day, or how many people are taking advantage of certain benefits. I think that that's a data point that maybe organizations don't think about, so that in and of itself, it doesn't mean something specific about the employees. But what it does say is that this benefit is serving more of our employees. Maybe there's something else in that area or that space that we can start to offer that will serve our employees. So there are a lot of different ways to think about engagement.
Absolutely. I see a question from Susan about procuring insurance services and determining DEI initiatives at publicly traded organizations. Now, a lot of these are going to have their data on their website, particularly perhaps in the careers page or in an annual report. Some of these companies might even have a specific DEI report. So a lot of times they're sharing this information publicly on their DEI initiatives.
So funny, because I was hoping you were going to go a little longer because I'm still scanning for other questions. But actually, we're pretty much close to the end of time. I'll ask you for a last word here in a moment. Before I do, this webinar series used to be bi-weekly, but now it's monthly, and I will be wrapping it up at the end of this year. So I only have 3 more sessions left. And in the next session, Masika Mahabir will be joining me to talk about code switching. And like, what does it actually mean? Because sometimes it can be an opportunity for empowerment, and other times it might be because we're trying to hide. And so we're going to be looking at that subject a little more October 25th. We are still in the process of setting that up, and so we don't have that available to register just yet. And Bernadette, I'm sorry, we should have put a picture of your book Up here, we didn't.
Okay.
What's
It's
the
back
title?
there.
It's right there. What is the title again? Inclusive 360.
Inclusive 360, Proven Solutions for an Equitable Organization. And it's a very practical DEI book. It's something that you can pick up and sort of flip through, and you're going to find tons of ideas. It's not up here. It's very much, I can use this.
I can do that. All right, final thoughts, and then we'll hand it back over to Gabe to close us out. You have a final thought you want to share? Something brilliant, Bernadette.
You know what? Stay the course. This is a long game. The world needs all of us to be part of this. However you identify, your role in this matters. And it just requires some intention. So start by figuring out, what is your own sense of purpose for this work? What is your why? Maybe think of that as some sort of joyful weekend homework.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you were able to join me today.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. And I love talking about this stuff. So it's a lot of fun for me. And I like to bring kind of a positive, you can do it energy, because you can do it.
You can do it. Together, we can make a difference. All right. Well, Gabe, I think that wraps us up, and back to you to close us out.